Hi there, and welcome to the show. I'm your host, John Ivison, and this week I'm joined by Conservative MP for Simcoe North, Adam Chambers. We're going to talk about what The Economist, in a recent edition, called fiscal fantasyland, a global phenomenon of endless budgetary deficits and soaring debt servicing costs brought on by a decade of uncontrolled public spending. So welcome, Adam.
Good morning.
Morning. So you sit in the Finance Committee, and this week you had a rather interesting exchange with the Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland. We would like to play a little snippet of that now.
Can you tell the committee and Canadians how much we're spending or projected to spend on interest on the debt this upcoming fiscal year? Just looking for the number.
Let me just say, because I think it's important to put things in context, that in both...
Minister, my time is very limited. I'm asking if you know the number. You have a lot of officials beside you. Will you tell Canadians how much we're going to spend on servicing the debt next year?
Here's what I think, that it's really important to put numbers in context. Without context, numbers are meaningless. Our debt service charges are low in Canada's historical context, and they are low compared to what our peers in the G7
Thank you for the context. What's the gross dollar value we're going to spend on interest on the debt next year?
And let me again, I really am opposed to fiscal fear-mongering by the Conservatives.
So by my reckoning, you asked her 4 times to tell Canadians how much the government will spend on interest payments in the next year, and she continually deflected by saying the number needs to be put into context. The figure that she dared not mention was low by historic standards and by comparison with other G7 countries. Now, if I was advising the Minister, I would have suggested she answer the question, that the debt servicing cost this year is going to be $43.9 billion, according to the budget. That then earns you the right to waffle and spin as much as you like. But it seems that, looking first at the parliamentary question, it does seem like committees are turning into mini question periods, a farce where there are far more questions than there are answers. Do you think it needs to be like that?
Well, no, it certainly doesn't need to be like that. I mean, you mentioned question period. I would say we have probably lost question period over the years in terms of, the back and forth and the substantive questions and answers. Committees tended to not be like that. They're much less formal interactions. Ministers tended to be a little more unguarded and a back and forth. In fact, if you look at even ministers today who appear before the Senate committees, there actually is a difference between how they are in the Senate committees and how they are with House committees. So it has lost a little bit of its effectiveness if these are the interactions that are going to occur.
Taking the substantive point, does she have a point that we will only, in inverted commas, spend 10 cents of every dollar on interest this year, compared to 36 cents when in the mid-90s when we really were on the brink? I mean, that's progress, right? So,
of course, any number can be put into context. First, I think we should be honest about what the number is. So it's $43.9 or $44 billion. If you wanted to put it into context, that would be one way to do it. The 10 cents for every dollar is a relevant measure. I would note that the 10 cents, though, is an interesting measure that we're currently at. That's the level that former Governor David Dodge says that's the tipping point for when he thinks we should start to get worried. So I think it's completely reasonable to start asking where we are in relation to some of those measures. The minister would be fine to provide that additional context. But I would say this is a government that's been changing the goalposts. When they first got elected, the measure they said they would hold themselves to was it's going to be $10 billion of deficits per year, and we would balance by the end. That goalpost changed to we're going to run deficits for a little longer. We're going to make some investments. Interest rates are really low. In fact, it was this minister that said because interest rates are so low, it would be irresponsible not to spend. And that's part of the reason why I think it's relevant to ask how much we're spending in debt servicing costs, because when the minister made that statement just a couple of years ago, our debt servicing costs were almost half of what they are today. So if you look at where we spend our money, you can tell a lot about priorities about where a government spends its money. Debt servicing costs are now one of the top line items where we're spending. And so if you look at, say, defense, you look at even healthcare, I mean, we're in a healthcare crisis. We're almost spending as much on interest on the debt in terms of servicing costs as we are sending to the provinces for healthcare. So, I think it's a relevant discussion to have back and forth about, how focused are we on kind of debt servicing. We issued a significant amount of debt over COVID. Some of it was needed, no doubt. At the same time, we should have a discussion about the maturity of the debt that's rolling over. We're now refinancing government debt at a much higher interest rate, which is driving costs. But also, when we were issuing the debt during COVID, one would have thought they might have taken advantage of the low interest rate and been issuing longer dated debt. But it turns out that's not the case either. Some of it was short term, some only 2 years. So that's also going to roll over. So we're going to see this debt servicing cost continue to increase. That's why I think it's a relevant piece to follow.
Right, and I mean, during that time, I don't think anybody quibbles too much with pandemic spending. That's a separate issue. It may be overgenerous, but it's a separate issue from what followed, which was the finance minister saying we can't afford not to invest. And decrying people like David Dodge, more or less saying that they were like generals fighting the last war by saying that the factors which held true in the 90s don't hold true anymore because interest rates are low and essentially this time it's going to be different. But, as you point out, $44 billion is money that could be better spent.
Well, look, every dollar that goes to debt servicing cost is cash. It's cash out the door and not on a social program that most Canadians rely on. For those of you who pay attention to some of the finance committee testimony, because we're looking at the budget, we had representatives from food banks across the country in yesterday and the day prior. Very, very sobering testimony about the reality of what's happening on the ground with food insecure individuals, or what's a consequence of some sky high inflation costs with respect to rent and food, pushing record numbers of people to needing to avail themselves of a food bank, which is that for a government that says the economy is really strong and we've lifted so many people out of poverty, I think there are some really tough conversations that have to be had about those people who are getting significantly affected by the current inflationary environment.
So the Economist piece talks about public debt in many rich countries becoming unmanageable because, in addition to post-pandemic spending binges, we're going to see, because of the demographics, the rising healthcare, defence, green investments are all putting additional pressure on budgets. The Economist's conclusion is that tax rises are inevitable. Do you think they're inevitable in Canada, whoever wins the next election?
Well, I think there is lots of revenue in the government. The one thing I would point out is, a lot of people saying they're having challenges with inflation. There is one entity for which inflation has been incredibly helpful. That's government revenues. The government's actually never made more money in terms of revenues than it's making right now. And the simple explanation to prove the point is you look at HST. Well, if the price of gas doubles, fuel, the HST collected on that good also doubles. So you've actually had significant corporate revenues, personal income tax revenues are up. So I'm not really sure, at least in Canada, that we are in a position where you have to start raising taxes. I think you have to start looking about where we're spending our money. There are a few pockets of areas. We're going to spend another about $21 billion next year on outsourcing contracts to including consultants. And so, there's not, you're going to have to spend a fair bit of time, but I think there's some pockets where you can look.
Right. So let's get into that, because when you look at program expenses, you're right. Budgetary revenues are at a record, and we're still in deficit. But the programme expenses in the budget for this current fiscal year are 446, nearly half of which are accounted for by transfer to people, which is elderly and child benefits, and to governments to the provinces in the form of health and social transfers. Another third is operating expenses for government departments, which is public sector wages. So any government really only has discretion over about $100 billion. So if you're not increasing taxes, you have to cut into that. So what would a Conservative government cut?
Well, I just mentioned, there's at least $21 billion next year that's being spent on consultants and outsourcing contracts and I believe if you look back to, say, the 2014-15 time period, say the previous government, I think that number was between 8 and 10, or maybe even at the most 12 billion, I think, when this government first came in. So they've ratcheted up a fairly large expense bucket there. Departmental spending, and we look at people costs, the size of the civil service has grown by 30% in terms of just overall spending. Now, at the same time, the demographic challenges that are hitting businesses across the entire country are also going to hit the government. You're going to also have a lot of people retiring, frankly. If you look at the average age of civil servants, like there are a lot of people that will be leaving the system as well. So it's not that necessarily you have to go in and start cutting a bunch of programs or things back, but someone's going to have to spend a fair bit of time.
If a Conservative government is going to reach 2% of military spending, for example, there's another $20 billion. So the savings you've just made on consultants are spent on defence.
So, look, the path to 2% or a path to 2% is not something that's even possible to achieve immediately overnight. I think you're going to have to figure out how to get there. But at the same time, not only you can look at the spending side of the equation, but if we get growth right from an economic perspective, I think you could have, we just had testimony last night, the Finance Committee. We're in the worst growth that we've seen in 10 years. Now, the government will say, well, but it's the best in the G7. But if you look at just total, GDP or GDP per capita growth, like we still have a lot of room to move. If you could get that up even by half a percentage point by focusing on some of the things we do well as a country and improving that, like, for example, energy, as an example, the world needs more energy, liquefied natural gas. That's also how you can pay for some increases in, or that's also how you can offset some of those. That would be great.
Forgive me chuckling, but every government I've covered over the last 20 odd years has said we're going to pay for it all by increasing growth, and it's rare.
Well, it won't be 100. It won't be 100% of it, but I think you have to consider both.
Yeah. So, on the broader philosophical point, though, do you think there's a realization among Canadians that that this time was not different? That governments have been living in fiscal fantasy land, and do you think politicians can have a grown-up conversation with voters, explaining that you can't keep spending with borrowed money, that Canada needs to get its house in order before we reach the brink again? Is that a conversation that can happen, particularly if the NDP and the Liberals are promising jam for everybody in their platforms?
Look, I hope that's a conversation. It's a conversation I'm able to have, or maybe more able to have in the most recent time. I think a lot of people are starting to realize, wow, we've been promised rainbows and unicorns for a long time, but now the bills are coming due, and how much longer could we keep this going, in terms of the promises. So I certainly hope the public is ready for a discussion about, look, we need to get some things right. By the way, like even just the fundamental parts of government are not working very well. You look at the backlogs in immigration, we still have challenges with passports, transportation, in the transportation department, getting just the fundamental kind of, basics that the government's services they're supposed to provide are even under challenge, but we're spending more and more and more on government. And so how do you figure out, I don't think we can go around and continue to promise the world to people when we can't even get the basics right at the moment.
Yeah. No, you're right. And good luck having that conversation. Adam, thanks very much for coming on. We appreciate it. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks for having me, John. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks.